Today we are going to continue to study the throne room of God in Revelation chapter 4. But first, we want to look back over these verses just to refresh our memory. After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, with one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and sardius. And around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning, and rumblings and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 lamps of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass. Just to remind us of the configuration in the throne room, that the 7 spirits of God represent this menorah, uh, and the inner circle of God, those closest to him, are these living beings, these cherubim, and then outside of that are the 24 elders. Around the thrones there were 24 around the throne there were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. Now, this is kind of I don't know, I think the one at the bottom right is kind of silly. It almost sets them up to be twins, but nevertheless, they are dressed in white, they have crowns, they're sitting on the thrones, they have musical instruments. All of these things are significant. Now, we have a number of questions to engage with when it comes to the 24 elders. Are they human beings who have been redeemed from the earth, or are they heavenly beings? First, I want to explore the possibility that they are humans. Most of the folks who go this route will suggest that they are the 12 apostles and the 12 sons of Jacob. And the reason they do this is because of this passage in Revelation 21 that describes the New Jerusalem, where it says, "And names were written on the gates, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. And the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb." And so a lot of folks will look at this and they say, there are 24 names in Revelation 21, and we know who they are. Therefore, when we encounter these 24 figures in Revelation 4, it must be the 12 sons of Jacob and the 12 apostles. Another reason folks think that this is a reference to human beings is because of the word elder. Presbyteros is a Greek word that elsewhere in the New Testament is used for human beings who are leaders in the church, such as when in Titus, where Paul says that Titus is to stay there in Crete and appoint elders in every city as I direct you. And James says if anyone is sick, then they should call for the elders of the church, and they're to come and pray for him and anoint him with oil in the name of the Lord. And so between these two aspects, that we do have 24 names later, and they are human beings, and these elders are addressed with a title that is usually used for, or always, in fact, in other places used for human beings in the New Testament. This suggests that they are not heavenly beings, that they are human beings who have been redeemed from the earth. Now, I do not agree with that perspective. I agree that it's compelling that 24 names show up in Revelation 21, and there are 24 seats here. However, there's a lot working against the notion that these are human beings, and you'll find that most Revelation scholars believe that they are heavenly beings, that they're angels, and there's good reason for this. As Bill says, the elders cannot be classified as actual redeemed saints, for they are clearly distinguished from the multitude of the saved in chapter 7. And the fact that they present the prayers of the saints in chapter 5 and sing of the redeemed in the third person also distinguishes them from believers. So consider this text here in chapter 5. It says that after Christ had taken the book, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each one holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, "Worthy are you to take the book and to open its seals." All right, so they have incense, they have musical instruments, etc. This seems to suggest that they are heavenly beings, because elsewhere in the temple, scenes in Revelation, it's angels who make up the priesthood, who are offering up the prayers of the saints, who play instruments, who do all the things that you would expect the priests in the Jerusalem temple to do. Elsewhere in Revelation, it's heavenly beings who do these things. And so since these 24 elders are obviously participating in this process, in fact, they're leading it, some have suggested that it would probably be best to understand them as priestly angels. In verse 10, and this is, I think, the most significant point, they say, "You have made them," a reference to the church, "you have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth." Now that's very interesting, because if they are among human beings who have been saved, if they are part of saved humanity, how come they refer to saved humanity in the third person as they or them? It doesn't make sense. If these were in fact the apostles and the Old Testament saints who had been preserved in waiting salvation until Christ, if all of these people are people who are redeemed by Christ, it shouldn't be them when they talk about the saved. They are a part of it, and therefore it's probably better to understand these 24 beings as being outside the human family, as being heavenly beings, angelic priests. Again, in Revelation 7, it will say, "One of the elders answered, saying to me, those who are clothed in white robes, who are they, and where have they come from?" Again, third person. "I said to him, My Lord, you know." Now that's very interesting, because this word that he uses to call him Lord, Kyrios, is not just a simple title of respect. It's a way of saying you're the boss, you're above me, you're higher than me on the totem pole. Now, if John is talking to other apostles or sons of Jacob who would be on his level, since he himself is an apostle, it's unlikely that he would use this title as a way of saying you're above me. If John the apostle is looking at other apostles, they are in fact his equals. And so again, this only makes sense if John is talking to an angelic being who's higher than he is. He says, "These are the ones who have come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." Again, this elder does not consider himself to be among those who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Also, does John potentially have a conversation with himself? If the 24 elders represent the 12 apostles and the 12 sons of Israel, then John, when he talks to an elder, he could be talking to himself. And even though lots of weird things happen in Apocalyptic, there's nothing this weird. No sort of psychological sci-fi mind trip. It's very strange. And if he knows these elders, because many of them, half of them would be the apostles, they would be people he knew personally in his life, you never get that sense that he's looking at people that he knew, uh, in his only years prior to this revelation. And so it creates a lot of awkwardness in the text if you see John as looking at the apostles and the sons of Israel and talking to them this way. He doesn't seem to talk to them like they're human beings on his level. And when they talk about the church, they don't seem to talk about the church as though they're a part of it. They talk about it as observers from the outside. And finally, we revisit a slide that we looked at in chapter 1, where the leaders of the churches in Asia Minor were called angels. And this is to show that even when the church is on earth, it has a heavenly identity and a heavenly existence. And now we see that angelic beings in heaven are being called elders, which is church language that is usually used of church leaders on earth. And so the language is being mixed up here on purpose. And this is just one of the ways that Revelation blurs the line that separates heaven and earth to show that for Christians, when we worship, heaven worships with us. When heaven worships, we worship with them. And our heavenly existence really passes over the dividing line between heaven and earth, and we are present with the heavenly beings and they with us. In the mixing of the language is one of the ways that Revelation communicates this idea. So we've established that there are heavenly beings, that they're not human beings. But that's only the beginning of the issue. We still have a number of other issues. Why are there 24 of them, for example? Now, you may recall that in 1 Chronicles chapter 24 and 25, the priesthood is divided into 24 divisions. You can see the divisions here. The Levitical priests were there were a number of families, and these 24 families would take turns, and they would rotate shifts in the temple. Of course, there are 12 months in a year. And so if there are 24 divisions, then that means each division of priesthood would work in the temple for a little over 2 weeks straight. And then they would, for the rest of the year, they would not work in the temple. If you were a priest, you would come in from the countryside the same time every year. And once you got there, you would take over and you would run things for a little over 2 weeks. And then you would leave, and the next division of priests would come in and take over. Now, in Hebrews 9 and in various other passages, we learn that the temple and the priesthood that was established in Jerusalem is a reflection of the temple and the angelic priesthood above. And if the earthly priesthood is divided into 24 divisions, then it makes sense that these 24 elders, who are leaders of the priesthood, that there would be 24 of them. They wear white like the priests. They play instruments like the priests. They offer incense like the priests. They're in the temple like the priests. They're clearly angelic priests. And just as the priesthood in Jerusalem had 24 divisions, so necessarily we have 24 elders because they are the leaders of these heavenly divisions of priests. This scene here is taken from Luke's Gospel, where Zacharias goes in to offer incense, and an angel appears to him at the right hand of the altar of incense. And the text in Luke explicitly tells us that he was from the division of Abijah, and so he was from the 8th division. And a lot of folks, since Mary would have been, appears when you read the text to have been pregnant for about 3 months when this happened, they try to establish when Abijah would have been serving in the temple. Because if you can establish when Abijah, the division of Abijah is serving in the temple, and then count 6 months from that point, well, then you can arrive at the time of the year when Mary was born. And so some folks have tried to use this device in order to determine when Christmas is. Now, the people I've seen who tried to use this established that Jesus would have been born around September or October. However, that's not a line of research that I've spent much time with, and so I can't say one way or the other. We have figured out why they have incense and they sing songs and all these things and they worship, and it's because they head up the 24 divisions of angelic priesthood in heaven. However, they're not just priests. They have thrones and they have crowns. As Richard Bauckham says, they are angelic beings who compose the divine council as their own thrones and crowns indicate. They are themselves rulers. They rule the heavenly world on God's behalf. And in fact, as we'll see, they rule the earth on God's behalf. The subject of the divine council is very complex and very deep. There's a lot that's been said and written on this. I don't feel the need right here to explain it in all its fullness. That would be its own presentation. That would be a couple of presentations. What I want to do here is simply show that this group of rulers in heaven who are in the presence of God, that this is not some new thing that Revelation has invented. That in fact you have seen this council elsewhere in the Old Testament. And I just want to go through a handful of verses that talk about the council so that when you look at these 24 elders, you will know the Old Testament passages to associate them with. Job 15:8, have you listened in the counsel of God, and do you limit wisdom to yourself? Psalm 89, for who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? A God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all who are around him. So he is in this council, but he is greater than those who are in the council. This one has been very controversial because here we can see that the members of this divine council sometimes fall, sometimes do evil, and are held accountable. Just like as Satan fell, these divine beings on the council are not always faithful. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. We'll come back and talk about this God's plural thing in a moment. How long, now God is rebuking the council for the way that they have conducted business on the earth. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Vindicate the weak and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and destitute. I said, you are gods, and all of you are sons of the Most High. When he says that, you should think of the angelic beings in Genesis chapter 6 who come down and have sex with women and create the race of the Nephilim, the giants, because they're called the sons of God and they're heavenly beings. You also see these same beings in Job chapter 1, where the sons of God present themselves and Satan is among them. Nevertheless, you will die like men and fall like any one of the princes. Some folks have been put off by the notion that there is a council and they're twice called gods. And so one of the ways that people have tried to say, no, there's not really these beings in heaven who are being called gods, is to say that this refers to the elders of Israel. But that won't work because these council members have done evil. The punishment is that they will die like men. Well, if they are men already, if they are elders in Israel, then it's not much of a punishment to end up dying like men because they were going to have to die like men anyway. That's what men do. Men die like men eventually. But if they are heavenly beings, as the text clearly suggests, then to die like men really is a consequence for their injustice because the heavenly beings were not designed to die. Now, when it called them gods, what we have to understand is the word Elohim, which can be translated either God or gods, is a word that is simply used, for divine beings from the spirit realm. God is called an Elohim. The gods are called Elohim. The members of the council are called Elohim. When Samson dies and goes to the spirit realm, whenever the witch of Endor brings him up, he's called one of the Elohim. Now, this does not mean that any of these beings rival Yahweh or that they're equal to Yahweh. These passages we looked at clearly suggest that Yahweh is greater than the other heavenly beings of the council. Nevertheless, they are called Elohim, which does not technically make them, gods in the sense that Yahweh is God. It just means that they are beings from the spirit realm. If the prophet Samuel is one of the Elohim, then that goes to show you that this title is not just for gods in the pantheon sense. It's for any, it can be used for any spiritual being that comes from the spirit realm. Now, the fact that they are called Elohim, and this is the same word that can be translated gods, that shouldn't bother anybody because as we have seen before, these beings, when they fall, there is a sense in which they are gods. That is, they become the gods of the nations. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 20, those who worship the idols, they worship demons. Right? The idea Paul has isn't that the pagan gods don't exist. He says they do exist, only that they are demons. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, he refers to Satan as the god of this age. Now, why does he call Satan a god? Because he's tracking on this Old Testament theme that when members of the divine council fall, they become the gods of the nations. And so, Paul is not a blasphemer for calling Satan the god of this age. A lot of these beings will be called gods, uh, the same language both in the Hebrew and the Greek Bibles, but you know, read carefully. It's not suggesting polytheism. It's not suggesting any of these beings rival Yahweh. And a final example of heavenly beings making decisions that affect the earth are the watchers in the book of Daniel, where judgment is carried out against Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel says, I was looking in the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He said, let the king's mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. This sentence is by decree of the watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whomever he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men. Now, if you didn't know that God sets over the kingdoms of the earth the lowliest of men, then apparently you haven't been watching the news, and you know you don't pay much attention to politics. We didn't actually need the Bible to tell us this. We could already tell this ourselves, but I guess it is helpful that it reminds us. Nevertheless, the point is the watchers here are making decisions. They have been delegated authority by God, and they make these decisions that affect earthly temporal rulers and earthly temporal kingdoms. As I said, I'm just trying to establish that there is a divine council in heaven. God doesn't need a council any more than he needs a church, but he chooses to use a council just as he chooses to use a church. If you want a deep study of the divine council that is very readable, this is the best thing on the subject. Dr. Michael Heiser wrote The Unseen Realm. I think if there are 10 books that every Christian should read, this is definitely one of the 10, maybe in the top 5. This is a very good book and very helpful for sorting out these things, sorting out the council, the sons of God who mate with the women in Genesis 6, the Nahash, the serpent in the Garden of Eden. He spends a lot of time on this subject. Very good work here. $10 on Kindle, $20 on hardcover, and $17 as an audio book. So available in a number of formats. If you don't like reading books that are full of information, um, you know, in a nonfiction format, he has also included this theology and this thinking in a set of novels that he wrote. And this is kind of like science fiction meets the craziest passages of the Bible. And he really does well to create an interesting plot and to facilitate this divine council theology and all of these biblical passages into these novels. So this is great biblical fiction. If you would rather learn about the divine council this way, within the framework of an interesting story, this is a good way to go. Only $3 in Kindle and $15 paperback. There may be additional levels to the fact that there are 24 of these elders. In the Testament of Adam, which was written in the 2nd century, it describes that in every hour of the 24 hours that make up a day, a different type of worship or prayer is offered up to God. At the first hour of the day, the prayer of my children ascends to God. I believe that's Adam speaking. And at the second hour, the prayer and petition of the angels takes place. At the third hour, the birds of heaven praise him. And at the fourth hour, the spiritual beings worship him. At the fifth hour, all the wild beasts and animals salute him. And at the sixth hour, the petition of the cherubim take place. Now, I'm not going to go through all of it, but this book literally lists what happens at every hour of a 24-hour period. And so prayers and petitions and worship is always being made toward God in the heavenly realm according to this book. Now, some folks have suggested that the reason we have 24 elders may also be to show that the worship of God is unceasing. It goes on 24 hours a day. It never stops. Now, I don't know if that's what Revelation has in mind. Maybe, maybe not. I just don't think it's clear. There's not a lot of evidence except for corroboration with this book over here, the Testament of Adam. So maybe, maybe not. I just simply regard it as interesting. Also, notice that the the birds and the beasts and the animals worship God according to the ancient Jewish mindset. Next week, in the next video, we'll talk a lot about that, about how the natural world has representation in heaven and how the birds and the trees and the animals of the field, how all of these worship God in their own way. We'll spend a significant amount of time next week investigating this theme because it's very important in the book of Revelation. And God's relationship to the earth and man's relationship to the earth is very important in the book of Revelation. Finally, 24 may be a shot at Domitian. You'll remember that the Emperor Domitian uh, requires that others worship him as though he is a god, and he has launched a persecution against the church. And for that reason, Revelation will always show that Yahweh upstages Domitian and that all the honors and glories that Domitian requires for himself only belong to Yahweh. Now, Suetonius, again, a historian, early 2nd century, talks about Domitian. And he says that when young girls ran races in the stadium, Domitian presided in his sandals, dressed in a purple robe made after the Grecian fashion, and wearing on his head a golden crown made of the effigies of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. So he wears a crown which has the images of other gods. And then he's sitting with the priest of Jupiter and the college of the priests sitting by his side in the same dress, excepting only that their crowns had also his image on them. So Domitian has surrounded himself with priests who wear crowns who worship him. Now, this may be a shot at Domitian. God is surrounded by priests who wear crowns who worship him. God has upstaged Domitian. Uh, all the all the honors that Domitian confers on himself are in fact only failed parodies of the true worship that God receives in heaven. Now, this is especially interesting. I won't read all this, but Cassius Dio tells us, Domitian had this terrible quality of wanting to be worshipped, but if you flattered him too much, he disliked that. If you didn't flatter him enough, he disliked that. There was somewhere like right in the middle where he wanted you to be, and it was hard to obtain that, and this made, Domitian very tyrannical. Now, it's interesting what he says down there in the second paragraph, where it says that Domitian affected to take pleasure in the honorary decrees voted him by the Senate, and he obtained the right to employ 24 lictors in the triumphal garb whenever he entered the Senate house. Now, the lictors, these were figures that different numbers of lictors uh, attended different officials in the highest parts of the Roman government based on their authority. There was a certain number that went with governors, a certain number with other officials, but the emperor usually had 12 lictors, and they have incredible authority. That's what that thing they're carrying around. It symbolizes authority. All of the lictors had the authority to put people to death without a trial. I mean, incredible authority that they could put people to death at will. There were not very many figures in the Roman government who could do that without any sort of a trial whatsoever. Nevertheless, they had that authority, and Caesar's usually had 12 of these guys. Well, Domitian, in order to give himself twice as much honor as the Caesars before him, he doubled it. So now he has 24 lictors. If you see Domitian in public, that's the thing that he did new. This is the thing that people would recognize him by. This is the thing that made him look so arrogant to historians like Cassius, who right after Domitian is dead. He always had these 24 lictors. And so, again, God may be upstaging Domitian in this image by having 24 authoritative figures around him, just as 24 lictors attend Domitian. So, a number of references behind the 24 elders. John says, "From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder." Scholars have recognized that this is a reference to the Mount Sinai theophany, maybe the most terrifying vision in Scripture, or the place where people are the most terrified, is when they come to Mount Sinai and God comes down out of heaven. And when he comes down, this is what you get, all these lightnings and peals of thunder, and the earth is shaking and all these things. And it's a terrifying scene, and the Israelites tell Moses, "Let God talk to you. Don't let him talk directly to us, or else we'll die." And it's just it's this terrifying scene. Well, John is now in God's presence, and so those same things that were taking place around God at Mount Sinai are taking place around him in his throne room in heaven. To us, because this Mount Sinai formula has a very specific function in the book of Revelation. The first time it occurs, it's because John has gone up to God's presence in heaven. But when it occurs after this, it's because God has come down out of heaven onto the earth, and the nations are being judged. And so the terrifying picture at Mount Sinai is being reproduced on a global level because the peoples of the world now have to come face to face with God. And so every time the final judgment is described in Revelation, this Mount Sinai formula will occur. Now, this is very important. All right, Revelation is not written in chronological order. It does not spend several chapters talking about human history, and then it gets to one place where it describes the second coming of Christ one time, and then it's over. That's not the way the book works. The book is written in cycles. It will look at history and the second coming from one angle, and then afterwards it will look at it again from a different angle. So we're going to see history told in 5 different ways, and each time it's told, it ends with the second coming of Christ. And every time we encounter the Mount Sinai formula, that is to tip us off and to let us know the end has just been narrated. You've just arrived at the point of the end, and so now the story is going to back up and start all over again. Each time history is narrated and the second coming is narrated, uh, it's narrated with progressively more details. So you get the seals, which is a very general story of history leading up to the second coming. Then you get the trumpets, which has more details. Then you get the 7 visions of holy war, which have some more details. And then you have the 7 bowls, and etc. And each time it becomes more detailed. Now that's why new details of the Mount Sinai formula continue to be added. If you look on the screen, every time this theophany occurs, more details are added. And that's just part of the way the narrative works, that we're going to look at history 5 times. We're going to look at the second coming 5 times, and each time it's going to be more detailed. And each time we encounter the Mount Sinai formula, it's going to be more detailed than the last time we saw it, and it's going to signify to us that the end has been narrated and the story is about to start over. And this is very helpful. A lot of folks look at Revelation for the first time and they say, this is a very chaotic book. I can't tell what's going on. I can't follow it. Well, there are several devices like this that John uses to help us, to let us know what's going on, to let us know where we are in the structure of the book. And so every time we encounter the Mount Sinai formula, I'm going to put it up on the screen because it's very important. It lets us know the end has just been narrated. So whatever we read in the next chapter, that's the story starting over again. Now, you don't want to make the mistake that some people have made and think that every time you read the second coming of Christ, that you are in fact reading an additional coming of Christ. In other words, there are people who think that every time Christ returns in Revelation, because they see the book is written in chronological order, They get to the second coming of Christ in chapter 8, and they say, okay, well, that's the second coming. In chapter 11, well, that's the third coming. Chapter 16, well, that's the fourth coming. And this is how people end up with this theory that there are multiple raptures, all right? Because they misunderstand this. They don't know that the book of Revelation recapitulates, that it starts the story over again, looking at it from different angles. They think it's written in a strict chronological order. It's clearly not, and we'll prove that in a variety of different ways. Uh, they think that, and so they end up thinking there are multiple comings of Christ. That is not the way it is. This book recapitulates, it backs up, and looks at the story again at a different angle. Verse 5, and before the throne were burning 7 lamps of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. Now, since we already discussed the 7 spirits of God in chapter 1, and since we'll discuss them again in more detail in chapter 5, I'm not going to say anything here except remind you that this is temple furniture language meant to be taken together with the next verse. So here he's going to show us the menorah that's in heaven, just as there was a menorah in the heavenly in the temple in Jerusalem, and it represents the 7 spirits of God. We talked about this, how the middle branch, the middle bough of the menorah represents the Spirit of God, and the branches coming out represent the characteristics of God's Spirit, which you can read about in Isaiah 11, verses 1 and 2. They are wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, knowledge, and the fear of the Lord. And then we come to the next piece of temple furniture. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. In the bottom left, you can see a golden bowl with the high priest in front of it. And this is the tabernacle of Moses. There was a golden basin. And this is where priests would wash their hands, their feet. They would wash to purify themselves, and they would wash the animal sacrifices so that they could be prepared and offered on the altar. Now on the right, you can see that this was greatly upgraded at the time of Solomon when he built the temple. Now the golden basin is referred to as the Great Sea, right? Sea, S-E-A, as in like the ocean. It's referred to as the Great Sea, and it's a massive bowl, and it's on the back of 12 golden oxen that represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And so, or excuse me, 12 bulls, my bad. And so, this is what again is being referred to. Just as there was a sea on that attended the temple on earth, so there is one in heaven. And the one on earth is a model or a copy. It's been copied according to the one in heaven. Now, what's interesting is there are 2 pieces of furniture that are outside the temple in the courtyard, and these 2 are called the earth and the sea. In 1 Kings chapter 6, the golden bowl is called the sea. In Ezekiel 43, the altar is called the bosom of the earth. Why is this? It is because the temple was meant to be a creation sermon in architectural form. The walls inside were engraved with flowers and trees to be like the Garden of Eden. The cherubim guard the Holy of Holies, the room in the back of the temple where the Ark of the Covenant is. The cherubim guard that. They are, woven onto the tapestry, the curtain that blocks the rest of the priests from the Holy of Holies. The cherubim guard the Holy of Holies just as cherubim guard the tree of life. And the laver and the altar again are called the earth and the sea, and they were positioned next to each other as a reminder that God had separated the earth and the sea on the 3rd day of creation. So if you went to the temple with your knowledge of Genesis, you would understand things quite well. Inside, when you see the flowers and the trees and the cherubim and all these things, that would remind you of the Garden of Eden. Uh, in order to go back there into the temple, to enter the temple and to move toward the Ark of the Covenant and toward the cherubim, you would have to be moving east. You will recall that the Garden of Eden was in the east. Outside, you have the altar that represents the earth and the basin which represents the sea, reminding us that in the book of Genesis, when God separates the waters from the land in order that life can appear. So the temple is one big sermon on creation. Now, the reason this matters for us is because in order to understand the scenery, we have to understand the biblical cosmology a little bit. And in this way of thinking, the John is up here where God is. God separated the waters from the waters. So the waters that are down in the sea, he separated these from these waters that are up here in above the firmament. The waters of the earth have been separated from the waters of heaven. And that probably explains why there is this golden basin, why there is this sea in the temple, because it reflects the fact that there are waters in heaven around God. And that's why Revelation is saying that before God there was a sea that was clear like crystal, like glass. It's letting us know that these are the waters that are above the firmament, up where God is, that were separated from the waters of the earth where the sea is in Genesis chapter 1. Now, one thing that's very important to recognize, essentially in almost all of the Bible, is that the roaring sea is a symbol of evil, it's a symbol of chaos, it's a symbol of creation being decreated. God has organized the creation so that it can be friendly to life, but when the forces of death and decreation take back over and the earth is returned to chaos, the symbol for this is usually the roaring sea. This occurs lots of times in the Psalms where the, it talks about in Psalm 89 and verse 9 how the sea swells and how its waves rise and how God has to still them. In Daniel chapter 7, these beasts rise up out of the sea. The same thing will happen in Revelation 13. These beasts that represent rebellion against God, they come out of the sea, both in Daniel and in Revelation. And if you just go through Isaiah and the Psalms, the sea monster who rebels against God lives in the sea. And so the sea, as a metaphor for rebellion and chaos, especially when it's roaring and raging and creating storms, this is a common symbol for evil in Scripture. Which is why the waters that are in Yahweh's presence are described as being a sea of glass like crystal. The waters are subdued, being in Yahweh's direct presence. He has mastered them. He has control of them. They are not going to roar and rage because that's a symbol of chaos and a symbol of rebellion. And obviously, the immediate presence of Yahweh is not going to be like that. He's going to have control over the sea. This is very interesting because whenever God comes to earth in Scripture, he usually brings a piece of heaven with him. All right? And if in heaven, the waters of heaven that were separated from the waters of earth during the creation week, if the waters in heaven are always still because they have been mastered, because they're in Yahweh's presence, well, that means when Yahweh comes down to earth and brings a piece of heaven with him, he is necessarily going to still the waters to make earth more like heaven, to make the earthly waters more like the heavenly waters. That's why you have so many scenes in Scripture of God taking control of the water. whether it be the parting of the waters at the Red Sea, setting a boundary on the waters so that they can't spill back over the continents after Noah's flood, Jesus on the boat, stilling and calming the waters of the sea, just as God did after the the men on the boat going to Tarshish throw Jonah over, and God, that's what God wanted them to do, and so he stills the water after they do that. Whenever God intervenes, whenever he is active on the earth, he brings a piece of heaven with him. And so since the waters in heaven are not allowed to roar and rebel against Yahweh, they are always subdued, they are always still, they are always calm. Therefore, when God intervenes on the earth, he's going to still the waters. Uh, and since the ocean is so oftentimes a symbol of rebellion, we'll see when we get to chapter 21 that in the new creation there is no sea, there is no ocean. And if we want to understand that, we don't want to look at the ocean the way that it's oftentimes looked at in the modern Western world, where the sea is maybe you like to go and play volleyball on the beach, or maybe you like to surf. We associate the ocean almost with a vacation, until, of course, we have a tsunami or a terrible hurricane. Well, the ancient experience of the sea, uh, there is no volleyball and there is no surfing. The sea is a very mysterious and violent thing. It kills fishermen. It conjures up storms without warning. Remember, there's no meteorology. Even though we have meteorology, the ocean still does things to us that are devastating. How much more so for people in the ancient world? And so it naturally becomes a symbol of chaos, of decreation, of evil. And it carries this connotation throughout Scripture until the sea is finally eliminated in chapter 21. Nevertheless, in Yahweh's presence there is waters, but they are not like the waters in Revelation 13 or in Daniel 7, which create and foment rebellion against Yahweh. They are under control. They are mastered. And that's why they're a sea of glass like crystal. Because when water is still, it's transparent. You can see through it. But when it's roaring and raging, that's when it becomes murky and muddled and you can't see through it. So these waters are so duly conquered by Yahweh's presence that you can see right through them uh, because they are still. Okay, next week we will continue our investigation of Yahweh's throne room.